Okay. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alan Smith. I'm chairman of the Systemic Resilience Forum of the CCRI. And on behalf of the CCRI, I'd like to welcome all of you to this very important panel discussion that we're having today on defining and measuring systemic resilience. The CCRI was launched at the UN Climate Action Summit in 2019 as a private sector-led global initiative bringing together industry and leaders across the finance and investment value chain to develop solutions to ensure that more finance flows into climate resilience infrastructure, in particular addressing physical climate risks. Since its launch, the coalition has advanced solutions to address systemic resilience at the national level, to ensure that physical climate risks are included in the design, structuring, and valuation of infrastructure assets, and to promote financial innovation to facilitate the flow of capital towards resilient investments. And our chairman, Emma Howard-Boyd, at the end of today will give you an even greater insight on that in the closing remarks. In particular today, though, we are here to look at how the systemic resilience aspect of it, that work stream which is looking to see how do we make the systems resilient and the tools to help us do that as part of that. And the Systemic Resilience Forum has pulled together a coalition of 50 members across governments, international organizations, private sector financial institutions, and technical experts to really help us have the language about how we understand how we should be assessing that. Because what we will be discussing today is looking at how we progress the challenges, address the challenges of really how we build systemic resilience. How can we provide the financial system with the correct tools and the right incentives, in particular the private sector, to make sure that we are making systems resilient. And also, most excitingly, I think one of the most powerful things about the CCRI and the SRF in prioritizing resilience, it has everyone at the table. The way in which we started, both in private-public sector, private finance, public finance, emerging economies, developed economies, it is really important that all of us are here together at the start. And at the start, actually, and it's quite significant that one of the most important aspects of where we've piloted is actually a systemic resilience tool in Jamaica, where we have looked at how do we assess resilience. And to give us a bit more insight into that and what has been really the exciting part of the program at the outset, I'd like to invite to the podium Professor Jim Hall. Jim is the director of the Environmental Change Institute and a professor of climate and environmental risks at the University of Oxford. He is internationally recognized for his research and practice on risk analysis and decision-making under uncertainty, and is at the forefront of systemic resilience and physical climate risks. And most importantly, he has helped us pioneer and expand and pilot Jamaica's systemic risk assessment tool. So without much further ado, Jim, if you can come to the podium, and we'd love to hear from you.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a great pleasure to be here and to talk about a very practical step that's being made in order to inform understanding of systemic resilience and inform decision-making on the pathway to resilience, starting in Jamaica. Before I go any further, I'd like to acknowledge the support, the incredible support from the CCRI, which has brought this coalition together, from the FCDO, the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, who's supporting our research and partners in the GCF, who you will hear from in a moment. And also from my team in Oxford and also in Jamaica, who we've been working very closely with the government of Jamaica, the Planning Institute of Jamaica in particular, over the last months. This has been a real and genuine collaboration. We heard on Tuesday from Prime Minister Holness at the launch of the IRIS, the Infrastructure Resilience for Small Island States initiative, how disasters are chronically and acutely impacting economies all around the world, in particular the most vulnerable economies and small island states. And in analysis, this is part of the research that we've been doing in Jamaica, we've demonstrated how infrastructure impacts, so in total that's the orange bar, are amongst the most severe impacts. And infrastructure is crucial in this context because it has the potential to lead to systemic impacts, not only across a whole state, but also through supply chains rippling around the world. And infrastructure is also really important because it's where vulnerabilities get locked in for the future. Choices made now about infrastructure investments could lock in vulnerability for years to come. And so it's crucial that we get those choices right. The impacts which we've analysed are large and significant at the moment. These are model results. The previous results you saw were actual empirical observations of what's happened in the past. Those two things are adding up. Our models are good, but the picture going forwards, if we put together the effects of climate change and economic growth and increasing asset exposure, shows that potential impacts are going to get much, much bigger in the future unless those investments are made resilient to the impacts of climate change, unless we make the right choices now. And in order to make those choices, there's actually quite a well-established process whereby we need to quantify and map the climate risks to infrastructure systems, then look very systematically across the whole range of possible adaptation options, and that entails potentially strengthening existing infrastructure or raising the standards of new infrastructure, nature-based solutions, which, for example, by ameliorating the effects of flooding or purifying water, reducing sediment runoff from catchments, can reduce the hazards to infrastructure. A more systemic picture of resilience where we look at connectivity, at backups, at recovery capacity, and then also there's always going to be residual risk once we've done all of those things, so insurance and other financial protections to protect economies and businesses from the inevitable impacts of extreme events, so that they themselves are more financially resilient. So our risk analysis framework enables us to then quantify the benefits of risk reduction and also the many co-benefits. And if we think about nature-based solutions, we can think about how many co-benefits there are in creating biodiversity, in creating better places for people to live, in sequestering carbon. And then quantifying it very clearly what all of the potential benefits are so that we can prioritize, and you'll see some prioritizations in a moment. And then those priorities need to be sequenced together in adaptation pathways. So sequences of investments, things we definitely need to do as a priority now, and then increasingly options for the future, which are triggered depending upon how climate change and other changes in society materialize. So in Jamaica, we've been working with Ccri and our partners in Jamaica to develop a tool to do those things with a view to informing resilient infrastructure decision-making across many aspects of the government of Jamaica. And again, the framework for that is now reasonably well established. It draws a lot on work from within the insurance industry, and I think it's actually reassuring that we're not talking about anything new here. We're talking about things which people who work on these issues have worked on for a long time. Understanding climate hazards, using a variety of different hazard layers for perils like floods, storm surges, droughts, hurricanes, salinization, wildfire, landslide, and so on. Then very detailed mapping of infrastructure asset exposure and the vulnerability of those assets. So when an extreme event occurs, how sensitive are those assets to the occurrence of that extreme? And increasing them, you'll see a lot of this, so keep an eye out for this in the work. We're looking at the connectivity of assets to one another. So how are transport networks connected together? Where is the power network supplying parts of the nation? Which catchments are connected via pipe networks to one another so that we can watch out for those sources of systemic risk? And then the final piece of the risk analysis framework is what are the impacts when things do go wrong? What are the economic, social, environmental impacts? And within a probabilistic framework, one then puts together large numbers of those possible scenarios of climate hazards, integrates that with the impacts in order to come up with the types of estimate of climate risk that I've just shown you. But the tool doesn't finish there because we want to go towards decision making. So we have a long list of adaptation options, and we can look at the benefits of risk reduction of those options in order to structure them into resilient investment pipelines. So let me skip to the tool. It starts here at the opening page. Maybe this could be a bit more fancy, but this is work in progress. But you can see the sectors we're prioritizing at the moment: transport, energy, water. We've been pushed by our partners in Jamaica also to look at urban drainage, at telecommunications, at waste networks. And so this is a first step, and there's plenty of room for expansion and extension. And you can see the categories of direct damage and economic losses that we're looking at for each of those networks. And just to skip through a few screenshots, I'm afraid I wasn't bold enough to give you a live demonstration, but these are screenshots of the real thing. We can see the level of asset scale mapping. This is roads here, and you can see in the call-out box on the left for a particular asset, which I've clicked there, an identifier, some information about its construction standard, the length, the width of it, how much it costs to rehabilitate per meter, how much it might cost to repair were it to be swept away. And that exists for every road asset in Jamaica now. We can intersect that with hazard maps. This is looking at coastal flooding here using storm surge maps originally done by Deltares for the World Bank. And with fluvial flood mapping, this comes from JBA. And we've incorporated all of these maps within our tool, and I'm clicking through different return periods of fluvial flood map outlines. So the work we've done then is to intersect all of that with the infrastructure assets. So, and the scale that you can see at the bottom there is the scale of direct damage in this instance. We also look at indirect damage, which would occur were that asset to be damaged by an extreme. And you can see the dark colors there are those really critical assets here in Kingston, which should be top priority for resilience attention. What are the ways in which those assets could be strengthened, or does one need to put additional connectivity in there to provide more resilience into the network? And that happens again right across the entire country. We then use that, and actually this list works from bottom to top. design issue there. Perhaps one eye goes to the top, but it's the one at the bottom, which is the asset with the greatest potential expected annual damage, depending on which scenario you're in. So it's those types of asset ranking which provide the long list to go then into further, more detailed outline design and project preparation in order to develop a resilient investment pathway. So this is work in progress. It's fantastic to be able to talk to you today about it. But we have more to do, as you will have seen, on that adaptation options mapping and prioritization. There's a strand within this being done both by my team in Oxford and also by the Green Climate Fund and their consultants, Arup, Deltares and Noal, who are looking at all of the opportunities for nature-based solutions for making infrastructure more resilient and incorporating those in the investment pipelines. And then a very strong element of capacity building. We've already worked, we have part of our team in Jamaica. We're working very closely and have had fantastic support from and interactions with a whole range of different stakeholders in Jamaica. And this tool, which is open source, you can find the code right now, such as it is, on GitHub. And it will be handed over to our partners in Jamaica to take forwards. That's not the end of it, however, in that the goal of CCRI, and indeed the goal within my team and our partners, is to provide capacity to do this type of analysis anywhere on Earth. We've piloted a version of this with the World Bank in Southeast Asia, and these are some screenshots from that Southeast Asia analysis. This was energy and transport infrastructure for all of Southeast Asia, floods, storm surges, and cyclones. Again, direct and indirect damage estimates. And we're continuing to work on this capability in a way which can be upscaled and rolled out right around the world so that we can empower decision makers to identify these climate risks, prioritize investment and adaptation options, and also, and this is very much a goal of CCRI, is to use this physical climate risk information to then mobilize finance for resilience, ensure that infrastructure investments are resilient in the future, and then also, and additionally, mobilize that adaptation aligned finance which is needed in order to fill the adaptation gap. We've heard announcements and ambition this week to 50-50, half adaptation, half mitigation finance. The question I sometimes ask myself is, well, do we have the right projects for all of that adaptation finance to go into? And we need analysis like this in order to make sure that adaptation finance not only materializes, but goes into the projects which will yield the benefits. And so let me close again with words from Prime Minister Holness on Tuesday here at COP, indicated the scale of ambition and indeed pride, I think, in Jamaica for this work going forwards. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim. And moving on, I'd like to kind of introduce our next two speakers who are actually already up on the stage. And actually, the first one, the Honorable Minister Purnell Charles Jr., I'd actually like to tell you a story because at this time, Minister Charles had been invited to be on a panel with President Obama. And he prioritized this over that. And when I asked him about it, he said quite bluntly, Alan, this is more important. And so, Minister Charles, thank you very much for that. Minister Charles is Jamaica's Minister of Housing, Urban Renewal, Environment and Climate Change. And he previously had several roles in the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and the National Council for Coastal Zone Management, amongst other areas. And he has been one of the biggest champions of CCRI in Jamaica, and we are very excited to hear from him today. Another very big champion of CCRI is Yannick Gamarek, who is the executive director of the Green Climate Fund and has had over 30 years' experience in climate change, development finance, and their interrelationships. Yannick will be speaking to the GCF's efforts to advance nature-based solutions and pipeline generation, and in particular leveraging the partnership with CCRI in Jamaica. And also, when I was coming in, Yannick said, Alan, we've already told 10 countries that will be using the CCRI model, so we hope it works. And as you can see from Jim's presentation, Yannick, we are very far advanced along the way. But maybe, Minister Charles, really just to ask you, what has been your key motivation for partnering with CCRI?
Thank you, Alan. If you'd permit me to remove my mask, which has now become a part of my body. I feel like it's an organ I'm taking off. Key motivation, not only the awesome people that we get to interact with and the friendships that we've developed, but if you listen to Professor, you see that this discussion, this panel that I'm on, is going to make a difference. We're not discussing the theoretical, generic, find all those nice words about catastrophe and the climate action, and I can roll off a couple. We are doing the dirty work, the granular dissection of how we are going to develop the framework that will create opportunities for countries like Jamaica to be able to identify what is necessary for us to truly become resilient. And I must tell you, Jamaica is blessed. We are honored to have the opportunity to serve as the launching pad. And I said guinea pig, and you said, no, pioneer.
Pioneer is the word.
and it is important for us as pioneers to also reflect, Yannick, on our responsibility to do everything necessary to make sure this becomes, not just a discussion, but an achievement for us. And with your help and with the government's support, we intend to ensure that we put this in context. So let me tell you, we have 7.5 billion persons in this world. The Caribbean has 42.5 million, less than 1%, a little bit over 0.5%. And that less than 1% accounts for the population of persons that are suffering up to 38% of the natural disaster damage in the world. Did you know that? Astounding. Not outstanding, but astounding. And so the reality is that when you speak about extreme vulnerability, it's not just a statistic for us. When we speak about the issues of the impact of these weather events on our infrastructure, you're talking about not just roads being devastated, but the impact of the roads, the consequences of those roads being impassable is that our children can't go to school. So it's impacting productivity, it's impacting access to learning. And when the poles come down, there's no electricity. And so it's impacting hospitals and access to even be able to recover from minor issues. And so the discussions around the scientific assessments and the systemic risk assessment tool are critical to formulating the real data that is required to design decisions and actions from politicians, that a ghastly group that I'm a part of, as well as us who have become collective activists in all our respective positions. Jamaica represents not just the Caribbean in this respect, because one of the things about this effort is that we are looking to design programs that are transitional and that can be translated to other spheres and countries, and that will have similar impacts. And I must tell you, when we first discussed the issue of being involved in what was defined then as pricing risk, we were having to contend with the argument of Jamaica, but you are one of the most climate vulnerable countries. So how are you involved in this discussion on pricing risk? And so we see it not as a threat, but as an opportunity. Because in defining those risks and in applying the prices of those risks, we become able to define the better solutions. And so not only will we become better prepared, but we will also be more attractive to investors and investment that can see the parameter within which they will be able to work in our country. It shouldn't be a difficult sell. And it wasn't for us. Because if you look on the partners involved in this process, you're looking on institutions that have already come to the discussion with a credibility and competence that really reflects success. So, we see ourselves as part of the ownership of the process, as the beneficiaries of the process, but more importantly, generations to come will be able to say that this discussion that all of us are having now is a discussion that was a springboard, not just as the systemic risk assessment tool for Jamaica to use, but that will lead to us opening our understanding of how we are going to achieve the outcomes that Jamaica and other countries require, not want. If we don't start having the granular discussions on how to formulate solutions, we may not be here in a couple of years. And so we see it from a different angle, Yannick. You know more than most, because you were in the Caribbean recently, and we almost didn't allow you to leave. We wanted you to become a resident and citizen. But the discussions are critical for the generations to come. So I want to just close off by saying thank you. Thank you to the hardworking teams that have immersed themselves. Thank you to the long list. I don't want to leave out anyone. So let me read the list of persons who are all integral. I know that we have the UK government, which is FCDO. I know that we have our friends from Oxford. I'm not finding it, but I know we have Wilson, Towers, Watson, right? Am I leaving anyone out? Mm-hmm. No? The GCF is supporting us in every way, but they're family. And the good team across Jamaica who are ensuring that we're creating that linkage, as I close, between climate risk data analysis and combine that with the traditional infrastructure and the nature-based processes now that are going to make us create bankable projects. I'll close by saying this, and this is the third time I close. Politicians close 3 times. So this is the final one. When I was in university, I wondered, how am I going to find a way to make my science degree connect to my law degree, then connect to this choice of becoming a politician? Being here, I realize, and that's why I've chosen to be on this panel, because this is the connectivity between science, between the policies and the legal framework needed for our country, between the political will needed for Jamaica to step up and say, yes, use us so that we can be one of the emerging countries to create the template that will be necessary for future. Yannick, let me hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. And to show that the scientists in you still rules, we're exactly on time. So thank you very much. Yannick, over to you. for your perspectives. And I think, again, your reflections of working with Jamaica and with the CCRI in advancing this too.
Thank you. Thank you very much. At the onset, let me say that I was not invited to sit on a panel with President Obama. But despite that, I'm extremely excited about being here, and I would like to deeply thank the government of UK, CCRI, and the government of Jamaica for inviting us to be part of this discussion. We have had a number of very good announcements last week that give us again hope that we might be able to achieve the Paris Agreement goals. We have had the announcement about zero deforestation by 2030, about the Global Methane Coalition, about the Breakthrough Agenda, about $130 billion committing to align themselves with sustainable development. So this is great. But in order to translate this commitment into action, we will need significantly more investment, and we will need investment in a different type of assets. And that will be one of the key challenges that we will have to contend with in the coming years. When we are speaking about climate resilient infrastructure, we are speaking about a double challenge. The first challenge is that we must address the current infrastructure investment gap, resilient or not resilient. We estimate that this gap could reach between $3 to $6 trillion per year by 2040 in developing countries. And we have to ensure that, so we have to mobilize this $3 to $6 trillion of infrastructure investment. And we have to ensure that this $3 to $6 trillion are green and climate resilient. So it's a double challenge. Normally, it should not be an issue, because last year, I think last time I checked, we had something like $14 trillion of assets in OECD countries that were earning negative interest rate. And an investment in infrastructure in developing countries normally should yield you at least between 4 to 8% of real interest rate, and in some cases much more than that. So we should see all this money moves from negative interest rate toward this infrastructure investment. And it's not happening. It's not happening. Anybody having listened to the excellent presentation of Jim can figure out why. It's because money does not only follow a return gradient. Money follows a reward-risk gradient. And if you have the impression that you could end up risking and losing 100% of your capital if you invest in an infrastructure asset in developing countries, you might decide that suffering minus 0.2% of interest rate is much, much better. And it's what is happening right now. And why do we have this extremely high risk perception about infrastructure in developing countries? There is a huge literature about basically risk associated with infrastructure investment, including one recent publication from GCF on scaling up climate finance in the context of COVID-19. But basically, there are a number of policy, macroeconomic, business, technological risk. And you are definitely not speaking about liquid asset. And if you have any kind of change in policy, for example, a revision of your power purchase agreement, you are in for a world of pain. And so this is already basically hampering capital flows toward infrastructure in developing countries. Now, you take climate infrastructure and you get a double whammy. Because climate infrastructure basically have a different cash profile than a lot of conventional infrastructure. You have a lot of upfront capital expenditure, high capex, in exchange for lower operation and maintenance expenditure, lower OPEX. And if you look at the NPV of the project at the end, a lot of climate investment infrastructure have a much superior NPV, but they have a longer payback period. You will have to wait much, much longer before you get back to your money. And therefore, you are more exposed to policy risk. You are more exposed to climate-related extreme weather event risk. You are more exposed to also technological risk, because often we speak about new technologies, new practices, therefore a much, much higher risk of cost overrun. And so if it's not going, if capital is not flowing to infrastructure today, it's certainly not to flow to climate infrastructure tomorrow if we do not do something about it. And what we have to do about it is basically to ensure that we provide the right information to investors on the comparative merits of climate resilient infrastructure versus traditional infrastructures. And for me, that's the reason why when we were approached to support this initiative, we immediately said yes, because we were given basically a vision on how to move from systemic risk assessment to a portfolio of bankable projects and an engineering platform for giving access to affordable finance to the most vulnerable countries in the world. Because for us, with the systemic risk assessment tool, we can enable countries to look at its entire resilience need, identify the infrastructures that cannot go offline, and after, what is the optimal portfolio of adaptation measures? What kind of gray infrastructures? What kind of green infrastructures do we need? And when it comes to the gray infrastructures, what is the internal rate of return of a climate resilient infrastructure in function of different type of climate future? And when you come to the conclusion that actually your internal rate of return is superior for almost every single possible scenario, unless you believe climate change is a hoax, suddenly you have the information needed to go to your board and say, let's invest in a climate resilient infrastructure. Individual investors cannot come with this information. They cannot conduct a 2 years systemic risk assessment. They often do not have access to the data to be able to rethink their investment appraisal technology. They often do not have the expertise to begin with to mainstream climate, physical, and transition risk into their investment. And that's what this tool provides. This tool will provide to investors a robust foundation, information base for them to basically make their own judgment call. And to me, once we have this portfolio of projects, we can also create something completely new. We can create syndication platforms. We can bring a number of different agencies around the table and discuss and basically do this financial engineering. What kind of projects are fully bankable? They can be financed by the private sector without any public money. What kind of projects need to be de-risked with public money? They require one kind or another one of blended finance, either basically a guarantee against overrun cost or a first lost equity or whatever other type of blended finance. What kind of projects have to be financed by the public sector? And what kind of financing instruments do we use? And so that's for me, the ultimate promise of this tool, ultimately, is that we will have optimized everything. We will have optimized the asset prioritization. We will have also optimized the financing. And maybe we will discover that the world of tomorrow might still be at our reach. And maybe at COP27, if all of us, we do well our job, we might also be able to come with a very strong message of hope. So my dream is that at COP27, we give a lot of hope to a lot of people thanks to this initiative.
Thank you very much, Yannick. That aspect of hope, someone told me recently, he said, Alan, hope does not mean optimism, but having that sense of possibility. And I think that word of hope is very powerful. I think also, Minister, when you said activists, I was at a New York Times Hub event yesterday, and they said that we aren't activists, we're factivists, that we use the evidence of what is out there to help us make and agitate in the right way. And I think this model is definitely going to help us to do that. And actually, to get some more powerful perspectives, I'd actually like to invite two of our very other important partners to the stage. Marie Durand, who is Managing Director of Moody's Investor Services, and Andrew Johnston, the CEO of climate fund managers to join us. Marie and Andrew. Yeah. And I think, and Yannick, I think you have another event to go on. So just to say thanks so much, Yannick, for your perspective and your support.
I'm afraid, I'm sorry, and it's still not the side event with President.
Okay.
Still something very important.
Yeah.
Very good initiative for the side event.
So thank you very much, Yannick.
Say hello to you, Alan.
Okay, so thanks. Okay, pleased to meet you. Thank you. Marie, maybe if I can start with you as we go. What do you see the value of a national risk management solution such as the CCRI's National Investment Prioritization Tool from your perspective at Moody's? Where do you see the value?
Yeah. Thank you, Alan, and thank you, everyone. Yes, I was listening with great interest here. Moody's, as rating agency, we have worked now for a number of years at really integrating climate change, ESG in general, but climate in our ratings, in our credit analysis. Why we're doing that? I think is exactly the words of Prime Minister Holness there, and what Minister Charles was saying. I manage a team that rates governments around the world. We rate 144 sovereigns. And a sovereign's ability to repay their debt is driven by economic strength, fiscal strength, the strength of institutions and governance, and vulnerability to event risk. And I think here in this audience, you can immediately map all of this to climate shocks, climate trends, and see the impact that it will have. As we've worked on this, on that integration, we've worked on making this more transparent. That's been a clear call that we've heard from financial market participants, that the need for transparency in our analysis. And so we have started publishing some scores that give us a measure, and give all of you a measure of the exposure to climate change. We do this by integrating climate science, which was very much similar to what Jim Hall presented at the beginning, this sort of mapping of climate pathways into projections of the proportion of a country, proportion of a population or economy exposed to different natural hazards. And we can then allocate that, associate that to a score. And what we find is that the sovereigns that we see as highly vulnerable, very highly vulnerable, is on a scale of 1 to 5, as the scores are 4 and 5 here, are 50 of these 144 countries. And they account for 60% of the world population and 25% of the world's GDP. So that is why we're doing this. Now, the work here comes in the second part of our analysis, or the parallel part of analysis, is that this is the exposure. I think the accounts that we are all increasingly familiar with and understand increasingly well. What we take into account as well is the capacity of a country to respond to this, to adapt, and to mitigate, ultimately, the effects of climate change. There is resilience at a broad level. Because resilience to climate shocks is likely to be related to resilience to shocks in general. There, the news is mixed. So that group of 50 countries has a rating, an average rating of B2. That's 6 notches lower than the average rating of their less exposed peers. That is an indicator of lower resilience in general. The average income level in these countries is $10,000 per year per person, adjusted for cost of living. That's 2/3 less than what we see elsewhere in the world. Government debt is higher, and the cost of debt is also higher. So these countries as a group are a priori less resilient, but really through the work that we just heard about now, that allows us to then look at resilience that is specific to climate. And there I was just exchanging some thoughts with some of you earlier before this panel. It is really quite striking how much better we understand the exposure and how much more we really want to understand the resilience that is specific to climate change. So it's really precisely this sort of works that will allow us to understand if a country's investment is, in the end, money well spent. That will allow us to take that on board as a mitigation of that exposure and allow us to differentiate in that group of 50, or really in the group of sovereigns around the world, and inform investors of our views to allow them to allocate funds appropriately. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie. And Andrew, turning to you, and obviously with your climate fund managers leadership hat on, I mean, hearing about the tool, but what more do you think can be done in terms of supporting investment in resilient infrastructure, and how do you see the value of the Ccri solution to that event, in particular vulnerable regions? We heard the 100 billion and the gap to the 100 billion in terms of infrastructure. What's your perspectives on that?
All right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So, yep, I represent a company called Climate Fund Managers, but in essence, we are infrastructure financiers. That's what we do. And in answering your question, I just want to take a couple of steps back and connect the decisions that go into actually financing infrastructure to the issue of the day, resilience. Infrastructure has been very powerful as a mobilizer of private sector capital as an investment class. And the reason for that is it's predictable, or it used to be predictable. You know, it's monopolistic, it's big. The revenue line was, to a degree, predictable because you could forecast traffic levels, wind levels. You could also anticipate that the use of that infrastructure, because it is a means to an end, it's an means to an end to trade, and you could have a fair prediction of how GDPs would grow and where people would move. And you could do that over a long period of time. That made it a low-risk asset class. And because it was low risk and because it was capital intensive, it was a perfect asset match for the big pension funds who sit with long-term liabilities. They have these obligations to pay out death benefits and retirement benefits. They span 20, 30, 50 years. Infrastructure was a fantastic asset class that matched that. Great for the balance sheet. That's why it worked. Now, the decision that one made when you're making an investment is you make it here and now, and you bring back all those future forecasts to a present value. Yannick used this term earlier on. And the way you do that is you apply a discount rate and you bring it back. And so things that happen in the future have a value attached to them, but when you discount it back, it's less than it is today. So with a time value of money, $100 in 10 years' time is less than $100 in 1 year's time. And therein lies a lot of the problem, is that the issues of resilience, the issues of dealing with how do you reset a road pavement, how would you restructure a bridge, how would you revitalize an asset at the end of its structural physical life, was so far out. It was year 12, year 15, year 30. By the time you discount it back, it's a nothing number. And because it's a nothing number, it was never really a conscious decision in the go forward. What made people invest in projects was the short term. So what resilience is, the concept of resilience is brought to the fore is that not only is the variability of those forecasts going to be much broader than we anticipated, they're going to be a lot sooner than we anticipated. And so the consideration of what resilience means as a functional asset is a today decision. It's not something you can defer because it's down the line in the investment model. So what does that mean? It really means that we need the tools. And we need the tools to be able to predict broader volatility and potential outcomes. We need the tools to be able to use as a decision-making forum. And most importantly, we need the tools to be able to inform the design to make these assets actually much more robust. This is not just about financial engineering. This is actually about proper engineering. And once we properly engineer, because we can anticipate what that asset is going to do and the communities that it serves in the short term, which is going to be different to how it was 20 years ago, then we can model it, then we can finance it. So it's a massively powerful tool. Up until now, and it's been a very short evolution of 5 years, suddenly thinking, wow, all the assumptions we made 5 years ago, we're using the best tools we have, but the tools are getting very blunt. And what this gives us is another toolbox which is nice and sharp and really gives us more confidence to make the go decisions.
Thank you, Andrew. And maybe Minister Charles, if I want one for you, because one of the things with you pioneering is that it sets a model, and what we'd like to know is your perspectives of how we should engage, or how leaders in other countries should engage as they seek to kind of take on board the systemic resilient assessment tool, in that not all politicians are scientists as well as lawyers. So how should leadership be thinking about it in that way?
So you heard the benefits of the scope of thinking from the private sector. But there's so many benefits from the perspective of the public sector as well. Because the tool will allow governments to be able to design more specific trajectories toward the green jobs, the sustainable development that we seek, towards the kinds of parameters that are going to be required for us to contend with the emerging economies that we want to really now strengthen. So this is it's not just about de-risking investment to make it look attractive to the investors who are looking to bring foreign exchange to your country, or seeking to make an assessment as to whether this risky space is something that I want to attempt. This is for the government to make the right decisions. And I dare say, as I listen on, as I learn more about the parameters and the variables that are being considered in how we design the examinations around the tool, it's going to be almost necessary for countries at some point to integrate this kind of systemic risk assessment into the national development plan. Because if anything else will lead to you making an investment that is not only short term, but that just won't make sense for you in the long term. So it's about us seeing the trajectory of how we allocate, particularly for us, those small developing states, how we allocate a tight budget in limited fiscal space, means we have to do more with the little that we have. And so relying on this tool gives us an opportunity to put exactly that square peg in that square hole. And I can see where, as Yannick spoke about coming back to COP27, I'm thinking even further down the line, where at that point, I can see our friend from Willis Towers and Watson speaking proudly of the investments that have been made and the impact that is having in the diversification now of the advantages being extracted from the tool. CCRI is just the way to go, and I would encourage other countries to look on what Jamaica is doing, because what we are doing, as I close off, is to see the tool as an element in a larger toolbox that is being utilized by our country to define a mechanism to make Jamaica see transitioning to sustainable development as a requirement. We have the catastrophe bond. We have our contingent credit claim. We have investments that we've made in terms of capitalizing our own contingency fund, Alan, moving from 100 million Jamaican, which is less than $1 million US, to 10 billion Jamaican ceiling, injecting $4 billion into that. So we are doing what is necessary to support not just the tool, but creation of an environment in our country where we allow Moody's and other international rating agencies to look on us and say, well, okay, Jamaica gets it. And Jamaica is doing what is necessary to create that enabling framework for investors to look on us as a viable option, for the country to find the viable pathway to really and truly defining the two things we seek: building resilience and achieving sustainable development.
Cheers. Thank you very much, Minister Charles. We actually have a little bit of time for a few questions from the audience before Emma comes on. So really just wanting, are there any questions from the audience that you'd like for the panel? Yeah, please.
Thanks. It's a brilliant session. It's been a brilliant session, and I must admit I didn't go and hear President Obama because of this session. And I'm the chief scientist at FCDO, so really pleased that we're supporting and partnering on this work. I had a question about other information gaps. So when I think about the mapping analysis, I think about some of the vulnerabilities that you might then identify. Do we have the green and clean solutions to how you create that resilience as part of what you will then invest in? You know, I'm just looking at that road and thinking, well, if it's going to get washed over, what's the kind of nuts and bolts types of things you need to do to make that more resilient, right? And I was just wondering if we have in our toolbox some of the engineering solutions or other tools that can really ensure we can make those investments in as cleaner a way that doesn't create new emissions. You know, it's that challenge of net zero plus resilience. So just wondering if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah. I'm always impressed by the ingenuity, the creativity of people who are looking for solutions. So, of course, we need more solutions, but I think there are lots of exciting solutions out there. Where I see the gap is in the evidence base to justify some of those solutions. And the trap we're in is that, on the whole, we have more evidence about the grey. We've been doing it for longer. We design it to specifications. We build it to those specifications, and we can predict reasonably well the way in which it's going to behave. Whereas the green, one's working with nature, and nature is an unpredictable entity in some senses, and we have much less of a scientific monitoring and evaluation framework there. So that is where I would focus the attention, is building up the evidence base. The other thing, as I said, about nature-based solutions is the multiple benefits which they bring, the co-benefits, and we need to value those co-benefits properly, and there are evidence gaps there too.
Yeah. Ken, maybe, because we have one of our really important partners here, Martin MacDonald, maybe Denise, I'd love to hear your perspectives on that. Yeah. I think is it speaking? It's Howard.
Hello?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Perfect. Thanks, Denise.
Trying too hard to turn that on. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. We've been delighted to work on a sort of sister tool from the tool we've been hearing about today, which we call PCRAM for short. So it models the physical impact of climate risks on specific assets. So the great work that Jim and the team have been doing, that we've been hearing about from Minister Charles, is more systemic level. We've taken that to another level, and Andrew, you might want to come in on this. We were chatting about it just before the panel session, weren't we? Where we've looked at a number of case studies, and we've looked at exactly what you were just asking about. Can we model the climate risks, the finance risks, the engineering asset data, put all of that together, and then use cost-benefit analysis to work out which are the most appropriate interventions to improve the resilience of a specific asset? So I'm happy to share some more on that. Andrew.
So, yes. Can you hear me? Yep, there you go. Answer the question, I do believe we have the tools. I think the engineering expertise and ways to build these type of things and maintain them and sustain them absolutely does exist. What doesn't exist is how one attributes a consequence of it either being damaged or having to be rebuilt prematurely. And I think what the tool does is it gives a common platform for that risk-sharing mechanism. It gives a lens through which risk can be attributed to a insurer, analysed by Moody's, or it can be accepted by ourselves as a lender, or it could be, Yannick spoke about blended finance, it can be attributed to a donor. And so, but it really comes down to building stuff and the cost of it. We've put a couple of our assets through the MOTS analytic tool, wind farms that we're building in Vietnam, for instance. And it's very clever. It identifies, from an engineering perspective, what element, what component of that physical structure is most likely to fail, given certain climate scenarios. Then you can design resilience in. from the outset, and you can also provision for the cost of the maintenance on the other side of the bookend. So the final point I want to make is the reason why infrastructure is difficult and why there's a deficit is that to make the simplest investment in a simple asset takes a myriad of decisions, and all of them are very bespoke to that bit of infrastructure. And it takes a long time, and there are multiple people involved. The more tools that we can have that are recognized and that can be adopted by all people around the table, the quicker those decisions will be made, and the quicker we'll be able to fill that gap. So that actually just having the tool in itself is a massive step forward, even before you start thinking about what the tool does.
Thank you very much. One question there, and then one question here.
Yes, I found the description of the systemic risk modeling exciting and extraordinarily powerful. And this addition of looking at the asset-specific performance is, I think, a great addition to the toolbox. I wonder if you've given much thought to extending that modeling one step further to go beyond the assessment of avoided damages to understand how building the asset in a resilient way actually increases the return from the asset by making it more productive, and that additional economic modeling may make it easier to attract the financing that you need at the start. Indeed, may be important for aggregating the financing of sustainable infrastructure, resiliently driven projects to provide a basis for securitizing them in a way that goes beyond the individual decisions on an asset.
Yeah. I guess maybe, Carlos, if I could ask, so while today we focused very much on the systemic resilience aspect of CCRI's more comprehensive program, and Emma can touch on the wider we'll be touching on the wider program later, that whole asset-specific modeling, understanding of that, understanding, as you said, how we do exactly up that up front is actually one of the other complementary work streams. Yeah.
And just to add, you'd have heard me speak about the potential for diversification of the tool in terms of its impact, and that's what I was referring to. The fact that the tool will and must evolve to meet the needs. And the question that was asked in relation to whether or not we have the solutions, I'm hoping that we don't have all the solutions yet. And I'm hoping that the tool will help to create some more solutions and be a catalyst for some youngsters who are in University of Oxford trying to take your job as professor to come up and say, listen, I want to challenge you. Man, I want to create better solutions. And I'm using your information to help me do so. I mean, that should be our goal, to get consistently better year after year at defining the dynamic kind of solutions that are going to be required. So this tool should be a stepping stool. It should be an opportunity for the solutions we have now to become perhaps more flexible and fit for purpose for Jamaica and other countries who have specific characteristics, and for us also to be able to create the kind of mapping and opportunities that are required for public and private sector to take on the capital needs that are going to be demanded if we build resilient. Building resilience for Jamaica means completely rethinking our operations. So it may be easy for you to say, well, construction should be this way if it's resilient, but that means so many other things for us in terms of capital demand. And that's where the private sector will have to come in. It has to be done as a partnership using this analytical data to help us define the mechanisms that are going to be practical for our countries. So very, very, very good questions from both of you. Thank you.
Thanks. Just one question here.
Thank you. My name is Wycliffe Ondieki from Kenya, working in the monitoring and evaluation in the National Treasury Public-Private Partnerships program. I'm very pleased to learn about this tool, first because I'm in the area of measurement, and now in PPP, again, we talk about infrastructure, and as you may be aware, Kenya is among the few African countries that have a fairly advanced public-private partnership program. As it is, we are at a stage where we are about to start the implementation, actually the actual construction of PPPs. And I think that my government will be excited, just like Minister from Jamaica is, if we can actually be part of the pilot for this tool. So I'll be very interested to know on how we can actually come on board and be part of this testing of this tool now from Africa this time. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And well, Carlos right here, take his number and he'll give you his. But no, and actually quite one of the really important aspects from CCRI in its entirety and from the SRF is that it is focusing in emerging markets and on the African continent. If it was one of the things which, even with the powerful announcements last week on the financial sector side, was that African voices weren't there. CCRI is very determined that African voices are here from the outset, and Southeast Asia, Caribbean, Latin America, i.e., those places that are most vulnerable. So please, that is a very powerful thing that you've just brought up there, and please do that. Just one last question.
Before we take that question, may I just respond to the question on return on investment? Because it's actually quite relevant in the context of this. Is that the longer you can spread out the repayment of the investment, the cheaper the use of that asset is. And what the absence of resilience is it threatens that extension. Is that until we can actually dimension and we can price and we can build that into the useful life of the asset, the fear is that financing will come shorter and shorter, and the use of that infrastructure will go up and up and up and test affordability levels. And within an increasing world of change, we should be driving the cost of infrastructure down, the use of it. So there, in my mind, is where the relevance of this lies. It goes straight to the affordability of it because it's repayment period.
Thanks, Andrew. Unfortunately, that will have to be the last question, but we'll take it afterwards, and because we actually have one of the most important bits of the event is really to hear from Emma Howard-Boyd, who has been our chair at CCRI, but actually has been one of the kind of life forces and energy forces behind us being here. So Emma, really to hear your closing remarks.
Thank you, Alan. And I think that question as to how do you get involved is so pertinent. We were challenged by the UN Secretary General a couple of weeks ago to work with up to 25 other countries over the next 2 years. And I think we're all incredibly ambitious to see what we can do by COP27. So I've really enjoyed this panel discussion and so pleased that so many people have prioritized it because I think it's incredibly exciting. As we use COP26 to amplify the race to resilience, adaptation measures have been quietly protecting people here in the UK. Over this weekend, millions of people didn't know we experienced the highest tide of the year. They didn't know because the Environment Agency, which I also chair, operated the Boston Barrier, the Hull Barrier, and the Thames Barrier. The Thames Barrier alone protects 125 square kilometres of central London, 1.4 million people, and over 320 billion of infrastructure, including, that's pounds of infrastructure, including 400 schools, 16 hospitals, and 86 train and tube stations. Vast structures like the Thames Barrier aren't the answer to every climate threat. They wouldn't stop the heat wave in Vancouver, the polar vortex in Texas, or the drought in Madagascar. But as events like this multiply, we urgently need to accelerate the race to resilience so that governments, businesses, and communities are including climate risks up front in their decision-making. As my fellow UN ambassador for the Race to Resilience and director of Slum Dwellers International, Sheila Patel, emphasises, local adaptation is not just what individuals, especially the vulnerable, do to survive. Everyone needs to blend traditional and new knowledge in a way that helps them make intelligent choices. The race to resilience needs transformative governance that will ensure legal practices keep pace with climate change and will support communities with the resources and knowledge they need to make change happen. I think the momentum is building here in Glasgow. Today, 33 cities joined the Cities Race to Resilience campaign, including Edinburgh. Today, a global resilience index went live, helping to improve the way insurers, financiers, and investors measure the resilience of countries, companies, and supply chains. Today, the Race to Resilience campaign launched a metrics framework that allows cities, regions, businesses, and investors to measure the progress of their work, building resilience to climate shocks for the 4 billion people most at risk by 2030. Today, a new $150 million investment in agricultural regeneration, announced by the Evergreening Alliance, will build the resilience of rural communities in Africa. And today, as we've heard, the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment, in partnership with the government of Jamaica, with the Green Climate Fund and the UK government, launched an investment prioritization tool in Jamaica. This will allow public decision makers to identify investments that protect the most economic and social value from physical climate risks over the next 20 years. And today, the CCRI also launched a physical climate risk assessment methodology, integrating resilience into cash flows for bridges, roads, and hospitals. And there have been many, many more announcements during this morning's ministerial discussions. A few weeks ago, the Environment Agency launched our third report to ministers under the Climate Change Act about how we are helping England prepare for climate impacts. In the press release, I said it is a case of adapt or die. Time is desperately short, which means there's no margin for pessimism. Since day one of COP26, the adaptation and resilience agenda has been gathering momentum. We need to plan, adapt, and thrive to save lives and livelihoods and deliver a new era of climate prosperity to the whole world. And I'm really proud, on behalf of my other co-chairs, that the CCRI, the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment, is one of those things that will help just that. A huge thank you to my panel, so Marie, Andrew, Minister Charles, Jim here too, and Alan for moderating this session. Thank you so much to all of you for attending our discussion. And I think we've got, after we finish, a couple of more minutes where we can discuss face-to-face any further questions you've had. But thank you for joining this panel, this session this afternoon. Thank you.